Good afternoon. Welcome to the Heritage Foundation and our Lewis Lehrman Auditorium. We, of course, welcome those who are joining us on our heritage.org website on this and other occasions. For those in-house, we would ask that courtesy that we check our mobile devices to see that they're silenced or turned off. And, of course, for those watching online, you're welcome to send questions at any time, simply emailing speaker@heritage.org. Welcoming our guests and leading our program today is Dr. Niall Gardner, who is director of our Margaret Thatcher Center for Freedom. He is a former aide to Lady Thatcher. He has worked at the heart of Washington policy world now for over a decade and is a leading expert on the US-UK special relationship. He is a regular contributor to the London Daily Telegraph and appears frequently, as many of you know, on American and British television. He received his doctorate in history from Yale University. Please join me in welcoming Gardner.
Thanks very much, John, for that very kind introduction. Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the Heritage Foundation and to the Margaret Thatcher Center for Freedom. It is my great pleasure to introduce the Right Honourable Owen Paterson, MP. I first met Owen over 17 years ago when he was Parliamentary Private Secretary to then leader of the Conservative Party, Ian Duncan-Smith, and I was working in Lady Thatcher's private office in London. Owen has always been a highly principled Conservative committed to advancing liberty, freedom and national sovereignty. As Margaret Thatcher would say, Owen is truly one of us. With over 2 decades of experience in Westminster, Owen Paterson has been the Conservative Member of Parliament for North Shropshire since 1997. He served as Secretary of State for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs from 2012 to 2014, and as Secretary of State for Northern Ireland from 2010 to 2012. Owen was one of the first British Conservatives to support Brexit and has been a prominent and robust voice calling on the UK to leave the EU single market and customs union. He has urged the United States and the United Kingdom to sign a free trade deal that would further strengthen the economic partnership between the world's largest and 5th largest economies. Please join me in welcoming my very good friend, Owen Paterson, just back from the Conservative Party conference in Manchester, who will talk to us today about why Brexit is great for the UK and for the United States. Thank you.
Well, good morning, or good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much for coming along. It's a great pleasure to return to Heritage, and I'd like to thank Niall immediately for the opportunity to outline the progress on Brexit and the great advantages a newly independent UK will bring to the long-term special relationship between our two countries. There's no greater place to make the case for an outward-looking, independent country than in the capital of one which stands one nation under God, indivisible with liberty and justice for all. As your Declaration of Independence has it, and I quote, "When in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another, a decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to the separation." So it's a great pleasure to be able to declare those causes and elucidate those principles once again. Of course, the US staged its own Brexit in 1776, and there are clear similarities between America's fight for independence and Britain's desire for control over our own affairs, only this time with fewer bayonets and muskets. The American Revolution and the 2016 Brexit vote had democratic control at their hearts. Everyone's familiar with the rallying cry of no taxation without representation. As with the EU today, Americans' dissatisfaction with British rule was as a result of our overreach in the colonies. It went too far, and America declared that enough was enough. You wanted to decide how to spend your own money, not to be told to send it off to Great Britain. On the 23rd of June 2016, 17.4 million people in Britain voted to leave the European Union, more than have ever voted for any issue or political party in our history. The 72% turnout was the highest since 1992. Article 50 was triggered on the 29th of March after 494 members of Parliament voted for it in the House of Commons. The automatic legal effect of this is that at midnight on the 29th of March 2019, the EU treaties in their entirety will cease to apply, with no post-exit treaty obligations on the UK. In June this year, we had a general election in which 85% of the votes cast were for parties advocating leaving the single market, the customs union, and the remit of the European Court of Justice. The main Remain party, the Liberal Democrats, saw its number of votes fall. The opposition Labour Party's position has vacillated to the point of absurdity since the election, but the Conservative government's position has not changed. Not a single Conservative MP voted against the Queen's speech this summer, which set out the government's plans for this Parliament and focused on regaining control of our laws, money and borders. The European Union Withdrawal Bill will repeal the European Communities Act 1972, which gave effect to European law in the UK. It converts into UK law the acquis communautaire, the entire corpus of European law. On the 11th of September, it passed its vital second reading stage in the House of Commons with a clear majority of 36, without a single Conservative voting against, 7 Labour MPs voting for it, and 14 abstaining. And more recently, in her speech in Florence on the 22nd of September, the Prime Minister again confirmed that our objectives remain unchanged. We're building on the precedent which Americans set even before independence, first adopting British law in order for it to be altered subsequently. The reception statute passed in the colony of Virginia in 1776 ran, and I quote, "The common law of England, all statutes or acts of Parliament made in aid of the common law prior to the 4th year of the reign of King James I, shall be considered as in full force, until the same shall be altered by the legislative power of this colony." Delaware, New York, Pennsylvania, and other states adopted very similar reception statutes. So the fact is, Brexit is going to happen, and it will be great for both the UK and the USA. Despite these decisive steps, there are still those, President of the European Commission, Monsieur Juncker, among them, who believe that we will back down or that the process can be derailed. This is unsurprising from a man who, before the French were asked to ratify the proposed European Commission in 2005, said, and I quote him, "If it's a yes, we will say, on we go, and if it's a no, we will say, we continue." He was true to his word. The French failed to ratify the Constitution, so it was simply reheated as the Treaty of Lisbon, and on the project went. When the Danes and the Irish had the presumption to vote against the EU consensus, they were told to go away and vote again until they produced the right answer. However, we will leave. For the first time in EU history, a country will not be cowed into rerunning a democratic vote whose verdict went against the Commission and the long-term European project. And this project is not static. The 5 Presidents' Report of 2015 proposed fiscal, economic, and finally political union by 2025. Without the restraint of the British pebble in the shoe, Juncker, in his State of Union address on the 30th September 2017, was proposing consolidation and compulsory membership of the Eurozone, and by 2025, a fully fledged European Defence Union. He called for a single European president and the use of passerelle clauses, allowing the Commission to bypass the concerns and wishes of democratic national governments. So I have absolutely no regrets that I was one of 3 founding MPs of the referendum campaign group Vote Leave. Our central message was that we must take back control of our laws, our money, and our borders. To control our own laws, we must end the jurisdiction of the European Court of Justice and leave the single market. To control our money, we will cease sending $11 billion net to the EU each year. To control our borders, we must leave the single market. And to control our trade policy, we must leave the customs union. These simple statements, which resonated with 17.4 million people, are not negative ones. They are not anti-Europe. They are positive expressions of the age-old truth that a sovereign country will be more successful when it governs its own affairs. Membership of the single market requires acceptance of the indivisible European principle of the four freedoms: the free movement of goods, services, capital, and most contentiously of all, people. It requires regulation of all aspects of our economy. Leaving the single market, which is simply the internal market of the EU, is a prerequisite for expanding our trade around the world, because we are, in the main, a services economy, and any services negotiation is a negotiation on domestic regulation, which we must control. 1999, 61% of UK trade was with the EU. Now it is 43%. By 2025, it's been projected that our exports to the EU will account for under 35%. The European Commission itself says that 90% of global economic growth in the next 10 to 15 years is expected to be generated outside Europe, a third of it in China alone. Compare that to the relationship between our two countries. The USA is the UK's largest export partner and our second largest import partner for trade in goods and services. 2015, the USA accounted for 19.7% of the UK's exports and 11.1% of imports. The USA and the UK are the largest single investors in each other's countries at 24.5% and 23.6% respectively. Only around 12% of the UK's GDP is directly accounted for by exports to the EU. Our dependence on European exports is actually even lower, as a proportion of our goods sent, in particular to the continental ports of Antwerp and Rotterdam, are counted as EU exports, but are in reality transshipped outside the EU. The economist Roger Bootle suggested that the proportion of UK GDP not involved in European exports may be as high as 90%. There is nonetheless a clear incentive to continue our trade with the rest of Europe. About 44% of UK exports in goods and services went to other countries in the EU in 2016. We have no desire, and it's in no one's interest, to abandon our close ties. Our goal is, and always has been, reciprocal free trade without tariffs. The idea that one can trade with Europe only through membership of the single market is plainly nonsense. Being within the single market means meeting all of its regulatory standards, and this sort of compliance is required on export product standards for all exporters wishing to sell in any foreign market. The difference with the European single market, however, is that those regulations are applied across the whole economy, even to sectors with absolutely no connection to European exports. The burdensome and invasive bureaucracy is a long way from the original vision of a group of sovereign states sharing a minimal common level of regulation. Many other countries, the United States among them, export successfully to the EU without being part of the single market, without paying a cent to the EU. 2015, you exported $273 billion worth in goods to the EU and imported $426 billion. Your service exports were worth $219 billion and European imports $169 billion. Why then is it essential for the UK to be a member of the single market? It is essential to demand that the UK regulate its whole economy to meet EU product standards on exports. We can do the same as the US and the rest of the world. While we remain in the customs union, we cannot pursue our own trade deals. Its advocates like to portray it as a cooperative trading association of member states akin to some sort of economic version of NATO, but it's not. In setting the common external tariff, the customs union denies its members the right to set their own trade policies and forces them behind a protectionist wall separating the EU from the rest of the world. New free trade deals may be struck only by the slow bureaucratic union and not by member states individually. EU trade negotiations need the agreement of 28 nations, so they limp along at the pace of the lamest camel in the caravan. Consequently, the EU has so far not concluded a free trade deal with the US, Japan, China, or India. Most existing EU free trade deals are in fact rollovers from the colonial days of individual EU countries. We must embrace quickly the trade opportunities around the world. Last year, our trade surplus with the rest of the world was $46.4 billion. Within the USA, $53 billion, and with Canada, $1.8 billion, and Australia, $5 billion. India's GDP has grown between 7 and 10% each year for the last decade as a result of economic liberalization. Brazil's average growth since 2010 has been over 3% a year. To take full advantage of the opportunities which these economies present, we must therefore leave the customs union. To the UK, the economic case is clear. Expert analysis from Professor Patrick Minford concludes that leaving the single market and customs union will provide a saving of $400 per household per annum on food bills, or some $10.8 billion annually. It will also bring down consumer prices more generally by around 8% overall and stimulate competition across the economy, raising productivity and GDP by around 4%. Minford's modelling is based upon unilateral free trade and assumes no subsequent reciprocal arrangements. The same results can be achieved by free trade agreements with our main trading partners, notably the US. Although the Commissioners of the EU might protest, the economic case for its member states to continue to trade freely with the UK is strong. The UK runs a monumental deficit of almost $100 billion a year with the EU. That figure went up by $13 billion last year alone. And Deloitte have explored the potential effect of a tariff war on the German car industry, which exports 1 in 7 of its cars to the UK. They assume a 10% tariff on vehicles and a 4.5% tariff on parts. They believe that EU car makers will lose $10 billion worth of revenues, with $8 billion from German car makers alone. In the first 12 months after the UK leaves, German car exports to the UK would collapse by 255,000 units, representing a 32% decline, with 18,000 jobs in the German car industry put at direct risk. We currently have zero tariffs, and conformity of regulations and standards is already in place. Spiteful protectionism from the Commission will accomplish nothing, but impoverishing all sides and is illegal under WTO rules. There ought to be no reason that independent countries cannot trade freely, and no reason whatsoever that free trade cannot be maintained with a fully fledged free trade pact. Reciprocal free trade is in all our best interests. If the EU refuses to have a free trade agreement with the UK, it will have far less effect on the UK than on the EU. EU tariffs averaging some 3% can be absorbed by our manufacturers, or they can easily divert some output to other markets. But if we impose the same tariffs on EU manufacturers, they will lose profits in the UK on top of the much tougher competition they will face from non-EU suppliers with whom we have trade agreements. US, New Zealand quality wine producers will be able to compete on level terms once we've torn down the tariff barriers of Fortress Europe. Furthermore, we are unlikely to pay the EU any divorce money if there is no trade agreement. No deal holds no horrors for us. Remember, too, that the EU must, under WTO rules on non-discrimination, provide the same seamless customs procedures and mutual recognition agreements that it provides to other countries. The case for free trade, however, is not based solely upon utility, but upon justice. The moral case is as strong as the economic one. The United Kingdom will be bold in stating it. The customs union has caused inequities in the European attitude to trade with the developing world. As the trade advisor for the charity Oxfam put in 2006, quote, "Not only does the common agricultural policy hit European shoppers in their pockets, but strikes a blow against the heart of development in places like Africa." As an example, after oil, coffee is the second most traded commodity in the world. The entire continent of Africa exports coffee to the European Union with a value of $2.4 billion, while Germany, without growing a single bean, earns $3.8 billion on exports of coffee. How can this be? The EU customs union has no tariff on raw beans, but any added value product is penalized. a 7.5% tariff is imposed on roasted coffee, ensuring that added value remains inside the EU and is denied to poorer African countries. This results in higher prices in our shops and further denies African nations the chance to add value themselves, creating the investment and jobs they need to grow. Some will say that many developing world exports come in duty-free or at low duties because of a generalized scheme of preferences or European Banking Authority programs. This is even less moral. It locks producers into arrangements and sets up a situation where they want the most favored nation tariff rate to remain high so their preferences remain in place. This is Alice through the looking glass, a transfer of wealth from poor European consumers to vested interest elites in developing countries, propping up the worst kind of crony capitalism. So much for a benign project of economic cooperation. It's not merely trade where the customs union has done its damage. It also adversely affects migration. Ghanaians consume tomatoes with virtually every meal. But the tomato industry in Ghana has been all but destroyed as a result of the dumping of subsidized Italian tinned tomatoes. Because of European tariffs, Ghanaian farmers are instead forced to migrate, often illegally, to work on the harvest in Italy rather than farm their own land. The protectionism of the customs union, therefore, is placing direct pressure on the borders of Europe and has played a clear role in precipitating the migrant crisis. But beyond that, however, is the simple question of principle. A sovereign nation should fully control its own borders. We recognise the skills and experience brought by workers and students, whether they're eye surgeons from Bangalore or skilled abattoir workers from Eastern Europe. It is manifestly in our national interest to attract the best talent from across the world. But we must be realistic. The UK's population grew by a record 513,300 last year to 65.1 million, with net migration at 335,600. The homelessness charity, Shelter, suggests that in a country roughly the size of Michigan, we would need to build a new home every 2 minutes, night and day, every year, so long as the current migration levels are maintained. Once we acknowledge that some restrictions are sensible, why should we be prejudiced in favour of Europeans over, say, those from the Commonwealth or the Anglosphere? Instead, a new bespoke immigration policy must be designed to meet the needs of British commerce according to fluctuating demands for skilled labour. The principles must be very simple. The United Kingdom will control its own borders. The discrimination against non-Europeans will end, and we will make, in Parliament, democratic, accountable decisions on immigration. The European Union's chief representatives have yet to adopt such a pragmatic mentality. Over the summer, the British government released a number of initial position papers relating to key areas of negotiating policy, to which the Brussels response has been ludicrously obstinate. President Juncker shrugged that the EU had received no definitive response from the UK on the question of the Irish border, despite the government publishing a 30-page document on that very subject. The arguments were not countered, not constructively appraised, but simply dismissed as not fitting the arch-federalist agenda. In reply, the EU has made a series of outlandish demands for an arbitrary divorce bill of $120 billion, rejected by the UK with a forensic legal rebuttal. We'll pay what we legally owe. Edward III's refusal to pay the Bardi and Peruzzi families in 14th century Florence was the last time the UK failed to honour its international obligations. We're also likely to continue contributing to a number of European educational and research schemes such as Horizon 2020 and Erasmus. But recent reports by the House of Lords and respected lawyer Martin Howe QC established that there is no credible legal argument obliging the UK to continue contributing to the EU's ongoing programmes after Brexit. Our attitude echoes that of George Washington, who wrote in a letter to Alexander Hamilton in 1796, "We will not be dictated to by the politics of any nation under heaven. farther than the treaties require us. The European Commission has also demanded that the European Court of Justice, the highest court in the EU, continues to rule on the rights of EU citizens in the UK after Brexit. If immigration was a manifestation of Britain's non-independence, then the continuing remit of the ECJ would surely be confirmation of it. There's no exact legal precedent for such a bizarre suggestion, which would create a privileged class of over 3 million EU residents in the UK, whose rights would be enforced by a court beyond the influence of our government and Parliament. Its closest parallel comes from the 19th century, when the British Supreme Court for China exercised extraterritorial jurisdiction over British citizens in concessions such as Shanghai, who were not subject to the jurisdiction of the Chinese courts. The British government has quite rightly ruled this out. Independent, sovereign nations cannot be bound by rulings of the courts of other nations. And once again, George Washington put our approach perfectly in that same letter to Hamilton. If we're to be told by a foreign power what we shall do and what we shall not do, we have independence yet to seek and have contended hitherto for very little. That's not to say that British courts should give no attention to future decisions of the ECJ. It's standard practice across the world for the courts of countries in an international treaty to pay attention to the judgments of their partners and to try, if possible, to apply a consistent interpretation. As the late Justice Scalia of your Supreme Court, himself no great friend of foreign judgments, influencing US courts, said, "We can and should look to divisions of other signatories when we interpret treaty provisions. Even if we disagree, we surely owe the conclusions reached by appellate courts of other signatories the courtesy of respectful consideration. It would be inconceivable for the US to accept any court overruling its own Supreme Court, but it has always been accepted that account be taken of preceding legal decisions. Take, for example, the case of Amalfitano v. Rosenberg in New York in 2009. The Court of Appeals ruled that attempted deceit was sufficient to sustain a course of action under Judiciary Law Section 487 on the basis that it derived not from common law fraud, but from the first Statute of Westminster, a criminal statute adopted by the Parliament of Edward I in England in 1275. We will adopt just the same attitude towards the ECJ's preceding decisions, but as a simple matter of principle, we cannot accept continuing ECJ jurisdiction once we have regained independence. Increasingly, regulation is made at world level. As a member of the EU, we've been represented as 1/28 of a vote on the world bodies, the WTO, the World Organization for Animal Health, the OIE, the Codex Alimentarius Commission, and the International Plant Protection Convention. We've been prevented from working with like-minded countries to tackle pressing policy concerns, prevented from reaching trade agreements with countries which would buy our produce. We can now retake our full seat, regaining a right to vote, a right to initiate new standards and propose amendments to existing ones, determined to cooperate with old friends in the Anglosphere and forge new alliances. For the US, this means regaining a partner at those regulatory tables, committed to global free trade, determined to embrace new technology, whose values of freedom and democracy you share. Britain has no greater ally than the United States. It was therefore disappointing, but perhaps not surprising, to hear President Obama opine last year that, quote, the UK is going to be in the back of the queue for post-Brexit trade talks. So it's welcome that the new administration is as pro-British as any we have seen since the Second World War. Your new ambassador to the UK, Woody Johnson, got off to a great start when he said last month, as far as the President's concerned, the United Kingdom, our most enduring ally, is always ahead of the line. The special relationship has been a cornerstone of our foreign policy for 70 years, whether that's procurement and development. The UK is the only level 1 partner in the largest aircraft procurement program in US history, the F-35 Lightning II, or our comprehensive intelligence sharing schemes. But our ties to the United States run far deeper than that. We're united by our history, our culture, and most of all by our language. With such strong and long-standing bonds, we should all be very optimistic about a new US-UK trade deal being, as President put it, very big and exciting. Indeed, as your new ambassador put it, I quote him again, Britain's decision to leave the European Union takes your country into new territory, but you are not heading there on your own. The United States is committed to standing with the UK through Brexit, whatever the outcome of the negotiations between the UK and the EU. Britain should know you will have a strong and reliable trade and investment partner in America. So, in the months and years ahead, Britain must be guided above all by the decision which its people made in June 2016. The constitutional position we face is unprecedented. We've held a number of referendums over the past 50 years, but this is the first in which the people have contradicted the view of the political, judicial, financial, media, and academic establishment. Failure now to deliver what 17.4 million people voted for would do catastrophic damage to the integrity of the whole establishment. We will leave the political and legal arrangements of the European Union. In a whole range of fields, security, academia, scientific research, cultural exchanges, we look forward to maintaining the closest possible cooperation with the EU. What we're offering is a vision of amicable, reciprocal free trade between sovereign nations, close neighbours, and good friends. Whether the commissars of the EU choose to engage constructively with that process or choose to remain stubborn and intransigent is their own affair. In any event, the United Kingdom intends to be bold and ambitious, retaking our place as a dynamic, globally oriented nation. For the United States, this is unequivocally good news. You are regaining an independent ally in trade and on the global bodies which determine world regulation. The special relationship will go from strength to strength. In George Washington's words, and I quote him to end, to animate and encourage each other and show the whole world that a free man contending for liberty on his own ground is superior to any slavish mercenary on earth. Thank you very much.
And thank you very much. That was a tremendous speech. I thought one of the most detailed speeches I've heard on Brexit, and I think some very, very powerful statistics actually in the speech. Very, very valuable for our audience here in Washington to hear that. Owen, before I open up the questions to the floor here, question for you with regard to Jean-Claude Juncker's State of the Union address, which was a sort of an emphatic sort of Euro-federalist rallying cry. Could you talk a bit about Juncker's speech, what that means for Britain as it negotiates a deal with the European Union? And does Jean-Claude Juncker's outlook, is that representative, do you think, of the European Commission as a whole? Does that reflect thinking in Paris and Berlin, or do we see a deeply divided European Union with regard to how to move forward with the negotiations with the UK?
Well, I'm not surprised in any way by Juncker's speech. This was always and remains a political project. It was always the intention, going back to Jean Monnet, to create a new European country. And one of the biggest breaks on that has been the membership of the UK, holding it back, because the UK people voted to join an economic arrangement. They were told they were joining the EEC. And they were not told they were joining an increasingly amalgamated and integrated political entity. So I described the UK as the pebble in the shoe, which is now leaving. They will crack on with this. And they made it absolutely clear. So the Five Presidents report a couple of years ago, before we had the referendum, made it absolutely clear that they've got currency union, which is an integral part of the political process. They will move to tax union, they'll move to economic union, and they want to move to political union by 2025. And Juncker's speech is wholly consistent with that. That is where the project is going. And at every stage, they've overruled the democratic views that have gone against it. And they've won so far. This is the first time anyone is going to stand up to them. So, and that's been confirmed again. President Macron gave a long speech, very long speech last week at the Sorbonne, confirming many more of these attributes. And they're clearly stating support for a European army, which is bad from the US's point of view, because NATO has been the great agency for preserving peace in Europe since the Second World War. And Macron confirming more and more integration and more European solutions to any outstanding problems in Europe. So none of this is any surprise at all. And they will crack on with this. And the European elite are completely united. And we're well out of it. You know, we are, in my opinion, only just going to get out in time, because I do not see this project succeeding long term. And it's certainly not succeeding economically. We know that. The figure I quoted, that 90% of world economic growth is going to come from outside the EU, is the Commission's own figure. And then you ask a very important question, are there any divisions? I don't see any divisions in the Commission. I think they're pretty well united on this. They simply don't understand the reasons why we voted to leave. They've got all sorts of caricature ideas. I've spoken in Europe a few times. I was in Berlin earlier in the year. I went to Hamburg just before the break in July. And I think the German elite is still very much bound in and very driven by working with the European project. The difference is when you get nearer the ground. So my ex-colleague, when she was the federal German agriculture minister, Ilse Aigner, was seen as CSU politician. So the CSU is the Southern German Conservative Party, which is always in alliance with the CDU. She's now the economics minister in Bavaria, and she's made very strong statements that the UK is a key economic ally of Bavaria. You've got BMW selling huge numbers of units to the UK. It's 950,000 cars the German sold us last year. You've got Siemens, and they've got the mini plant in Oxford. Tremendously close economic relations. And she said, don't mess it up, basically. You know, do not cause a recession in Bavaria by cack-handed negotiation. But I think the elite is very much driven by the European project. So the Juncker speech and the Macron speech are all of a piece, and we're well out of it.
And I'd like to invite questions from the audience. And please do keep your questions brief, and do identify yourself in any institutional affiliation as well. So, yes, sir.
Thank you very much. My name is Eric. I'm an intern here at the Heritage Foundation. My question for you, sir, is in regards to the ongoing crisis in Catalonia. Specifically, what do you think the EU should do in response to that, and what are the implications for the future of the EU based on what they may or may not do?
Well, I have to say, obviously I've been to Catalonia, I've been to Spain a few times, but I wouldn't say I'm a great expert. The problem for Spain is that Catalonia is the most wealthy area. It's a bit like London declaring UDI from the UK. And it's a very real problem for them. I think there's fault on both sides from what I've read. I mean, I've read the referendum was not very well organised. There's been cases of people voting several times. But I think also it looks to me as if the central authorities in Madrid are being cack-handed. I mean, the scenes of policemen beating up people who exercised the democratic vote were not good. And the European Union has blundered in. The last thing the European Union wants is for any breakaway anywhere, because European borders, as anyone studied them, are shifting the whole time. So the most recent big change was obviously the readoption of the old DDR, the East Germany into West Germany, the split of Czechoslovakia into two, but nobody's really mentioned the fact there's 500,000 Hungarians who were left in what became Czechoslovakia at the end of the First World War, who were part of what was old Greater Hungary. There's a large number of Hungarians in Western Romania, Transylvania. There are rumbles in Silesia, which was German under Maria Theresa, and that was conquered by Frederick the Great and was part of Germany until Poland was formed. So all across Europe, you can see areas. Belgium's very split. You know, the Wallonia and the Flemish don't get on. big time. So the European Union, I think, has been pretty cack-handed in making some pretty blundering statements. You've got to be very sensitive in these areas. And you could, I'd thought the way that Catalan vote has been handled, you could drive moderate Catalans who are actually not in favour of independence into the independence camp. So I think the European Union has got, it's got a long-term interest. It's trying to create a homogenous state. Don't forget that. It doesn't want any disruptions on the way.
Thank you for that question. I have a question right at the back there.
My name is Rico Benitez, and I'm a veteran. Can you clarify that you said that Great Britain was kind of not knowing they were joining the EU, or because they're joining the Commission when Tony Blair and David Cameron, they seemed like they were leading the EU to join, Great Britain to join strongly. They were proponents of that. Can you explain that better, what you mean by you weren't sure what you were really joining when you were talking about the Commission?
Oh, sorry, yeah, right. Well, in 1972, the UK joined something called the European Economic Community. So although Jean Monnet, after his horrendous experience of the Battle of Verdun, when he was responsible for getting shells up to the front, and his experience of the failure of the League of Nations, which he saw failed because democratic states could go against the general will of the main majority of the League of Nations. And it didn't, so the League of Nations didn't have a veto over the democratic states. So he was determined to create something, absolutely determined, where you could overrule the nation states. They couldn't get that through without the guise of building on the base of an economic project. So it was sold to the British people as an economic project. So in the early 70s, the UK was doing badly. It had a Labour government. We produced appalling products. There was an Austin Allegro was a car which had a square steering wheel and guaranteed 40 things wrong with it. And it seemed, and the empire had gone, and was it Dean Ashton said in the UK, it's lost an empire, not got a role. And it was seen that France and Germany come bouncing back from the war. And I remember as a child being taken by my father on trade trips. And going to France, they were really exciting. They were growing, and there were cranes, and there was new this and new that going up. And it looked like the place to be. And the UK was sold that it was joining an economic project, a market. They were never told that they were actually joining a fledgling nation. And they were lied to, and they've rumbled the lie.
Thank you. Yes, Dan.
Hi, my name is Dana Coaches. I'm an analyst here in our Thatcher Center. So you talked a bit about Germany. So of course there's sort of the elite opinion, but I think the economic interests of the country, as you mentioned, with a lot of the advanced products that are exported from Germany, certainly in favor of strong continued economic relations between the UK and Germany. And the latest Eurobarometer poll, for instance, has a higher number of Germans have faith in their own national government than in EU institutions. So I'm curious sort of what you see as the interplay between the sort of German national interest and sort of Germany's role within the EU and what the Merkel government, especially with a new potential coalition with the Free Democrats, how that could change sort of their position as far as negotiations with the UK. Thank you.
Well, this is the absolute key question of the whole thing. My position, and many who think like me, think this should be very easy to organise. The European Union has a huge surplus, as I described in my statement, with us. We have no tariffs. We have conformity of standards and recognition of regulation. It should be the easiest thing in the world to arrange a free trade agreement. What is extraordinary is that so far the Commission is not discussing free trade. It's discussing really peripheral issues like the border in Ireland. And having been Secretary of State in Northern Ireland and having quite a long contacts in Northern Ireland, I really do think that is not a very major problem to overcome. There is huge goodwill in Ireland, both sides of the border and across the Irish Sea, to continue the common travel area, which has been going since the 1920s, and to maintain easy transfer, frictionless trade of goods and services. Today, across your border between Windsor, Ontario, and Detroit, 10,000 trucks will go over the border. And you happily describe them, I think, as alien trucks with alien drivers and alien goods and alien invoices, and they don't even change gear. With modern technology, some of the most contentious borders in the world have been speeded up. I mean, Finland, Russia, Pakistan, Iran. So I really don't think the Irish border with modern technology is a problem. But the EU is deliberately focusing on these issues rather than getting onto free trade. So what I said at the conference this week, and I'm very happy to repeat it again, is that if the EU does not show serious intent to negotiate free trade arrangements on the basis of reciprocal free trade based on mutual recognition of conformity of standards, by Christmas, we should give clear notice on January the 1st that we are leaving and we're going to work on WTO terms. And don't forget, you, the USA, along with India, have increased your sales into the single market at twice the speed that we have while we've been members. So we've been paying a fortune, what is it, about 10 billion a year net. You haven't paid a penny in, and you've doubled your sales on WTO terms. So that's where I think we are on free trade. Where we are on the balance, and this is the big crunch, because as I've just explained, the gentleman there, that this is not a democratic project. It was designed to overrule the democratic institutions of member states. Who is going to have the bigger clout? Is it going to be the drivers at the centre and those who are members of the political elite, which I've met obviously in Germany, or is it going to be those nearer the ground actually making and selling things? And it's not entirely clear yet how that is going to pan out. You mentioned the German election. I think that's a setback for everybody because Merkel is going to play a very strong role in this because someone's going to have to pay the 10 billion to keep the current programs going, and they are the biggest contributor. We've been the second biggest contributor so far. And Germany's commitment to the project is such, they will probably stump up more money, but you need a strong German chancellor to do that. And there is no government at the moment. You've got everybody, in some ways everybody did badly. So there's going to be no grand coalition of the socialists because Schulz did so incredibly badly. And there is very hard to see how she's going to get the Free Democrats and the Greens to agree, basically on the issue of energy. So when they closed their nuclear power plants down at the behest of the Greens, the answer was to build some hideous new lignite power stations. This is burning coal the colour of these seats. And it's revolting stuff and very polluting. And it's almost an existential issue for the Greens. I mean, I can't see how the Greens could be part of a government that endorses burning lignite. But someone's got to keep the lights on. So I think there will be very long negotiations. And Brexit will just be an irritation for Merkel. I think it won't be her main project. The main project, obviously, we're trying to keep the government of Germany going and get it established, which will be a very difficult thing to do.
Thank you. I'll take a question here first, and then I'll move to the other two.
Wayne Bowles, President of the Bowles Company. What can the U.S. business community do and your British business community do to help facilitate the enactment and signing of the free trade agreement between our two countries?
You can be immensely helpful because up to now we've had a 20, 30-year consensus, mainly with the State Department, that the EU is a good thing. As I said in the speech, it's some sort of benign form of NATO. And it was convenient for the United States there's this sort of slightly idiotic idea there was one telephone line you pick up and get Europe to answer it. Now, thankfully, we've now got an administration which is very clearly pleased that the UK has voted to leave and has made very supportive noises, not just your president, but as I said, the ambassador turned up. And what is really important is that you do say this very loudly. And what is important that the Commission understands that you want this and you are for real. And if we stay in the single market, and if we stay in the customs union, and if we stay on the ECJ, we can't get cracking and sign a deal with you. So it would be brilliant to have loud voices from the US business community saying, we want these negotiations to succeed. We want the UK to leave as rapidly as possible. And all this talk about transition is a smokescreen from some producers. And in some ways, you could characterize the whole debate as a battle between the consumers and the producers. And there are significant economic elements. A lot of the trade associations in the UK are terrified of letting go of nurse. And it's a nice, cozy arrangement, and they can live with all the regulation, and they've got a nice slot. They don't want new competition coming up from below. They certainly don't want competition coming from outside. and they want to keep their cozy place. Now, of course, against that, you've got very large numbers of consumers who will be massively improved. Their lives will be improved, and they'll be enriched by us leaving. So it's really important we have very loud voices in the States saying that as rapidly as possible, you want a full departure of the UK from the single market, the customs union, so that we can start really negotiating with you. Because until we've left, we can only talk. We can't actually sign.
See, the gentleman over here and then the lady.
My name is MD Karim. I am a public policy maker. My question, in the beginning, you say USA exit from Britain was beneficial for USA. Like that. So my question is whether when USA break down into USA and CSA, is what that was beneficial for both?
I don't want to get too involved in your history, but I thought most Americans would be happily, that's what their antecedents did, setting up the United States of America. Those that didn't pushed off and founded Canada, which has also been a very successful entity, but also left, of course, on very similar terms. When we left Canada, all imperial English common law was turned into Canadian law. It's the same in Australia, same in New Zealand, same in India, same in Republic of Ireland. That was the point I'm making. You take on all the existing imperial law, adopt it, and then fillet it later. The Indians are still filleting away. They set up a commission in the 1950s, but last year they repealed a very important imperial act, I think it was from about 1847, on the protection of elephants. So they're still going through imperial law in the Indian Parliament.
Hi, I'm Julia. I live in Italy, just came back to DC a couple days ago. While Brexit was occurring, talking to a lot of entrepreneurs, they were of two minds. Some were pleased, some were disappointed. Those disappointed saw the UK as a counterbalance to Germany in the creation of a large trade force that could compete against China, India, Asia, which they see they cannot do alone as individual states. On the other hand, they were those who were pleased with Brexit because it gave them hope for their own efforts to leave the EU, which many people there do. So how would you see the UK's role towards Italy and some of the southern states and maybe some of the poorer nations of the EU, of Europe?
Well, it's a very interesting question because many of the southern states, the Club Med states, are suffering terribly from their membership of the euro. And they went into the euro at a very disadvantageous exchange rate. And they've suffered hideously cruel levels of unemployment, youth unemployment, catastrophic lack of economic growth in Italy's case, which is a wonderfully creative, productive country. The idea that small countries can't do trade deals is utter tosh. If you look what New Zealand has done, Australia's done, once you are out and you're free, and you have a sane policy towards agricultural subsidies, which is the big blocking issue on nearly all trade deals, you can sign up trade deals. And I've talked to Alexander Downer, who was the foreign minister. He's now their High Commissioner in London, their ambassador in London. Australia has been very successful. I was down in Australia talking to Tony Abbott when he was the Prime Minister. They made it absolutely clear that it'll be a great opportunity. And these countries are really looking forward to us leaving. And because I banged on about the world bodies, getting the UK back on those world bodies and working with like-minded allies like the US, New Zealand, Australia, other open-minded trading countries will be a huge advantage. Your really interesting question is, what are these other countries going to think about the UK? And I've had interesting letters and papers sent from Dublin about an our exit, because there are people in Dublin who are waking up to the advantage of Ireland leaving. The Dutch are looking at it. We know some of the Scandinavians are. And that's where it'll be very interesting to see if the intransigence of the Commission means they are determined to punish us. And there's been this statement, very unwise statement, that the EU will not come up with any settlement which leaves the UK better off than where it is within. because they are terrified of the project being damaged. You know, we may have torpedoed the project below the waterline. We may have done grievous terminal damage to it long term. Personally, you know, we wish them all well. We wish these countries in Northern and Southern Europe the very best. But I think you specifically asked about Italy. It has been appallingly damaged by the euro. Membership of the euro has been incredibly damaging. And it's very hard to see how you generate the economic growth in the club-made countries while they remain in the euro at the rate at which they entered it.
We have time actually just for a couple more questions. One question over here.
Hello, my name is Jan Bollmann. I'm from the German embassy, and I heard some interesting arguments. I just wanted to ask if you think that after the election disaster in the UK, if you think that your government is strong enough. You just told us that you think that the Merkel government will probably focus on holding the government together, and doesn't the same thing count for the British government after the big election disaster for the Conservatives? And do you think you should maybe hurry up a bit before the British make up their mind again, and vote maybe a Labour government during the next elections? Thank you.
Grüß Gott, es freut mich, dass jemand von der Deutschen Botschaft hergekommen ist. I wouldn't entirely agree with your interpretation that the election was a disaster. The Conservative Party got 13.7 million votes. That's the second highest number of votes in British history after John Major, who got 14.2 million, and compares very favourably with Tony Blair's so-called landslide. He only got 13.5. Or Lady Thatcher's victories with a much smaller electorate when she got 13.5. The problem we have, for all sorts of internal reasons which I won't bore you with now, the UK is incredibly bad at keeping its constituency boundaries updated with population moves. So the current electoral system is biased to a point of about an advantage of at least 20 to 30 seats in favour of the Labour Party, because the populations are moving out of the cities to the suburbs and the rural areas, but we're not readjusting the constituency boundaries to keep the populations within constituency level. So that's the background. But you're quite right. It was not the great triumph we expected when we were 20 points ahead. And the electoral arithmetic means that we are in a coalition with the Democratic Unionist Party in Northern Ireland. So you're absolutely right that it has weakened the government's position, and we are beholden on working closely with the DUP, who, of course, on this issue are very, very sound. They are a very strongly sceptic party. And on many issues, we have a lot in common with them, and we can work with them. I think what the problem we've got is the public perception, which you've picked up on, in that nobody really took the Corbyn leadership seriously. I mean, here is someone with completely unreconstructed 1970s views, who, when he used to go on holidays in the DDR, he's got colleagues who advise him, who write articles today defending the old DDR, which I went to before the wall came down. The old East Germany was a horrendous totalitarian communist mess, which did terrible damage to what was once a prosperous part of Germany, and it's still trying to recover. Corbyn admires Venezuela, where they're eating the bears in the zoo. He admires Cuba. All the hideous things have happened in Cuba. So nobody really took him seriously, and there have been 2 attempts to defenestrate him, and the Blairites have failed. So suddenly this election comes along, and it's given him respectability, and he is on a bit of a roll. He's doing very well in the polls, doing well with young people, and all the hideous lessons that were learned before Mrs. Thatcher took power and corrected them may have to be gone through again if we're stupid enough to elect him. So you're quite right. The election was not the success we expected, because we went into the election 20 points ahead and came out with having lost our majority. But it's not absolutely the catastrophe that you're describing. And if you look at the electoral arithmetic, I can tell you there are no Tory MPs that want an election. And there are actually quite a large number of Labour MPs that do not want an election because they're Blairites, and the last thing they want is to have Corbyn as Prime Minister. And one of the less helpful things left behind by the Cameron-Clegg coalition government was the Fixed Term Parliaments Act. So a Prime Minister can no longer just at a whim call an election, which used to be a big, big tool in the UK Prime Minister's hands. Now we have to wait 5 years. So currently, I don't think the electoral arithmetic will change. So I do think we will leave, which is very important on the issue I've been talking about, on the 29th of March 2019, because I don't think we will have the electoral arithmetic to reverse that vote.
Should be noted as well, I think that Theresa May received about 8 percentage points more than Angela Merkel, actually, in the German elections. So you can compare that. You know, so you know, putting things in perspective. Owen, just a last question, actually, just switching gears a bit to the Iran nuclear deal. That's the dominant sort of foreign policy issue right now here in Washington. Intense speculation that the Trump administration will decertify the deal, possibly withdrawing from the deal altogether. October 15th is the deadline for decertification. If indeed the United States does withdraw from the deal, what do you think the response will be from the European Union? Of course, bearing in mind the huge amount of, you know, French and German investment pouring into Tehran at this moment. And but could you give us your insights on the sort of the European reaction to a move by the United States?
Well, I think you're right. I think the feeling in Europe would strongly be to keep the deal for the commercial advantages. And I've picked up the last couple of days, there are very strong commercial entities here in the US who want to keep the deal. I mean, very large numbers of civil airliners, for instance, have been sold, as I understand it, to Iran. And I think you just got to be pretty careful who we're dealing with. I mean, for me, Iran is a complete, utter tragedy. I was recently not so far away. I went riding horses in the Caucasus in Georgia, and it was quite striking when you see a road sign which says Tehran, 1,200 kilometers or something. We weren't that far away. And you had this strong feeling. It was this incredibly ancient nation, ancient civilization, which has been hijacked by this theocracy and is obviously being held back, and is not well run and has hideous human rights problems. And it's one of the great tragedies that Iran was lost, I think. So I think we've got to be, there's a real balance, and it's very, very, probably you would need really detailed knowledge of it, which I've not got. I've not really been involved in this. But I think you've got to have a balance between the current commercial interests and not being too greedy for important commercial entities, and the hideous danger of a regime which has been actively sponsoring terrorism and doing real damage to hundreds of thousands of human beings and causing large numbers of deaths and a real threat to world peace. What you would like to do, of course, is to slowly bring Iran back into the family of nations, and it should be as one of the great civilized countries of the world, which it once was.
Well, that brings us to a close for today's event. I'd like to thank Owen Paterson for a tremendous speech today on Brexit, and also for his answers to a whole series of questions. And Owen, also we wish you and the Brexiteers in London all the best during the negotiations with the European Union over the next couple of years, and of course we'll be keeping a very, very close eye on developments across the Atlantic, and also in terms of a potential US-UK free trade agreement, which is already being discussed and negotiated. So thank you very much for joining us here today, Owen, and we look forward very much to seeing you again.